Hello, everybody, and welcome to a little live broadcast, LinkedIn Live from Chad and I, also available on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media, and my YouTube channel as well. How you doing, Chad?
I'm pretty good, and you?
I'm really good. This is exciting for us as well. So Chad and I, since April last year, so nearly a full year, have been doing something called the Engineer Innovation Podcast, and we've been putting out a new episode every other week for that whole time as well. So I'm not sure how many episodes that is, but it's at least 20 odd episodes in the last couple of seasons, and actually got quite a following, I think, so far as well. And we've interviewed some really exciting people. What is the podcast about, Chad?
It's about engineers talking about what they face in their day-to-day work. It's about the coming trends that they're seeing. We've talked a lot about artificial intelligence in the last year. That was a big one. But it's not just about AI. There's a lot of other things that are influencing how people are working, whether it's the change in technology, the change in demands, the change in consumer products. There's so many different influences on their work, and we explore that with them. We have conversations. It's not to just talk about their work in the sense of, okay, this is what I did, A plus B equals C, but rather, well, this is how it's changed, this is how the paradigms change, this is how the environment's changed. So it's more about the human connection than just the technology only.
And I think things are changing faster than they've ever changed as well. So the actual pitch for the podcast was engineers talking to engineers,
Yeah.
and we've more or less kept that alive. It was supposed to be about simulation and test in the beginning, but all those other things have crept in, and now it tends to be as much about AI, machine learning, digital twins, industrial metaverse, all the fun stuff that's happening at the bleeding edge of engineering. So today we wanted to talk about the latest edition of that podcast. I think we called this "Dude, Where's My Flying Car?" Chad, tell us about your latest edition of the podcast, which we released last week or this week, was it?
Oh, it actually came out last week. Yeah, it was with a company called Airborne Motorworks. They came on the podcast to talk about a project they had been working on. And I got to talk to Jesse Marcel, who was the co-founder of the company and worked primarily on this project. And he told us how he had a vision for his company and what he wanted to do, and then he had to completely change it. So it was a conversation about repurposing some of their initial ideas to go from an idea that was feasible and workable, but maybe not going to be commercially viable in the short term. And when we explored how does one go about completely changing a project of that magnitude and going from a time frame of a few weeks to years for something, and how to change their business purpose on a dime almost.
So he started the company in order to make a design for a flying car, yeah, and it wasn't
Yeah.
just a small idea. It's something they're still working towards, something they made a lot of progress towards. They developed their own motors, which we'll talk about. They got lots of patents. They got loads of partners involved. They had loads of funding until to the stage when they went to talk to the Federal Aviation Authority and said, what sort of legislative obstacles do we have to overcome before getting this car to fly? And at which stage they put their hands up in horror and realized it was going to take a lot longer than they
Yeah,
thought.
it's not a simple, like, okay, yeah.
Which is why
Was
the
almost
whole,
a debate which was more complicated, the engineering to make it fly or the regulations to get the car in the air to some extent. But, it wasn't just that he wanted to do a flying car. This was like a specific vision he had. He wanted to be a sporty, stylish, kind of fun to fly or drive, whatever. I don't know. What would you say a flying car? Are you driving it or flying it? I don't know. But he wanted it to be like a sports performance feeling and not just, a mode of transportation. So, and they got pretty far with that vision before they hit those roadblocks that you mentioned.
and they're still working on it too.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this kind of this left turn, this segue they did into a different application. What was the application they moved into?
So they went from this idea of a flying vehicle to wind turbines, which sounds like a big change. I mean, it's definitely not staying even inside the same industry. We're going in a completely different area. But the idea that was behind this shift was the electromagnetic propulsion motor that was in their flying vehicle, they thought could convert nicely to what would be the generator inside these wind turbines.
So you're an EMAG guy and I'm not. So basically, so a motor is you apply electric potential to it and it spins round and move things. And if you, instead of applying electricity to the motor, if you spin it what you get out is so a generator is a motor operating in reverse, basically.
Yeah, in a nutshell. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously different aspects to it than just that, but in a nutshell, that's how you could summarize it. But in this case, it wasn't just spinning it the other way. We were going from something that was, less than 2 feet to a wind turbine that would be many, many more feet, almost 12 feet or bigger. So a huge scaling up. So it wasn't just taking the same device and spinning it another way. It was rethinking the whole thing to accommodate this new industry that they were going into.
And what sort of challenges did they face on that journey?
There was a lot in terms of the materials, in terms of the structural that they talked about. They worked with MyHTT, which is one of our preferred resellers on doing the simulation behind the change in application. So they were validating the CFD, the structural, the electromagnetics. They had to rethink that as well. So there was a lot of different physical aspects that they had to reevaluate because of the change in nature of the application.
Which is really exciting. And how successful have they been? So that these wind turbines aren't in operation yet, but they made some I think really, really exciting claims about the amount of energy they're able to extract from the air compared with traditional wind turbines.
Yeah, they were getting, I think they were saying their last benchmark was over 70% or some very high percentage of converting the kinetic energy of the wind to
And
electrical potential.
and when they started, I think they said when they first started the kind of the simulation and test effort, they were at 12% as well. So that's a massive increase.
Yeah, massive.
Let's just hear from what's his name, Jesse Marcel,
Jesse Marcel, yeah.
the third as well. Let's hear what he said on the podcast.
So for me, the most exciting thing is literally from starting with a clean sheet of paper that wasn't that clean by the time it was got to the design and through our iterative processes and finding out that although we're not wrong in the design we were doing, but how well it fits into this new adaptive architecture. And we couldn't be more excited about the direction of the company. And we're still at the beginnings of this project. There's lots of little tricks that can be done with the current design, but you got to start somewhere. There's so much more to go. And as the saying goes, pretty common, your first design is going to be its worst.
Yeah.
I think our first design is going to be mind-blowing compared to what's out there.
Which is really exciting as well. So I love that simulation journey. I love how they've segued from one application to another, and I love that they've been very successful in that process as well. And of course, it's not the first example. We were having a chat off mic before about some of the other accidental engineering discoveries, or good things that have been salvaged from engineering projects which might have been regarded as a failure. So Alfred Nobel was trying to design a new sort of putty to make rods and accidentally invented dynamite and then used that money to fund Nobel Prize. You talked about one as well, Chad. What was your example?
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, Teflon wasn't initially meant to be a non-stick adhesive. They were looking to create a chemical for some completely different application, and they realized, it's pretty good at making sure food doesn't stick to your frying pan, and that's how that came about. But there's all sorts of examples of these accidental discoveries, right? Like the intention was to come up with something to fix a certain problem, and then in that journey, they realized they could solve another problem on the way there, or maybe they shift gears for whatever number of reasons. But I guess the big distinguishing point in this case is that Airborne Motorworks wasn't accidentally falling into a wind turbine. They didn't design this flying vehicle and go, oh, well, geez, we made a turbine instead. No, they had to repurpose what they did. So it was a much more intentional act, which in some ways is almost more impressive if you think about it, because that's, not just a shift in terms of your mentality, but like, to see the vision of repurposing this initial engineering work in a completely different way. That's not a minor feat of creativity and examination of the facts on hand. Plus, they didn't just look at it from an engineering point of view. They looked at it from a business point of view. They had a multifaceted approach to understanding where they could apply what they were doing into something that would be commercially viable in a shorter period of time. So,
and of course, they haven't given up on their flying car project as well. So
No,
if you look at their website,
no.
so Chad, when you've got a second, if you could just dump the website in the chat so people can click on that link and they can see the wind turbines and they can see the flying car concept as well, because it's all really exciting. You just mentioned Teflon, which was a byproduct, I think, of the Apollo space program. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But Jesse Marcel as well, the guy you interviewed, if you Google his name, you'll get a whole lot of other interesting stuff that isn't necessarily to do with his engineering career, because he is part of a very famous family. Can you tell us a bit about Jesse's grandfather and father, Chad? We didn't talk about this in the interview, but perhaps we're going to do this next time.
Yeah, so Jesse Marcel is actually Jesse Marcel III. That's who we spoke with. And like you mentioned, his grandfather and father have a pretty interesting historical connection. His grandfather was involved with the 1947 Roswell incident. He was one of the first military personnel on site to investigate that happening in 1947. And he's very fascinating person in himself, both Jesse and his grandfather and his whole family, because they've stayed close to that incident and what it's meant in terms of, cultural zeitgeist. So we didn't want to talk about it too much on the podcast because it wasn't the topic that we were talking to Jesse about. And of course, that topic is got a lot of lore around it, and we didn't want to stray away from what we were talking about, a very serious engineering problem, to that. But he's a fascinating person, and like you said, we could have probably had a whole conversation about that. And I guess it's interesting for us too, because when we talk to people like Jesse or anyone else, we talk to them about a specific engineering problem or why they are working with us, and then we find out so much more about the people we work with when we have these conversations, because they share things about we had other people on the podcast share other hobbies and interests with us that we found interesting. And it's really you can always, sometimes you can try and connect the dots. Like, is the relationship to Roswell why he's fascinated with flying cars? I don't know, maybe not. But I think we've had other conversations with people and we're like, oh, you like this, and that kind of maybe explains why you're so passionate about this aspect of your work.
So Jesse's grandfather, who was also called Jesse, so Jesse Marcel the first, I guess, was one of the first people on the scene at Roswell, handled some of the wreckage. A bit later, made the claim when he was out of the military that he thought that the wreckage was extraterrestrial and not a weather balloon, which was the official explanation. His father took some of that wreckage home and gave it to his grandfather. Took some of that wreckage home, gave it to Jesse's father, who handled it when he was 10 years old, and talks about, alien hieroglyphics on some of that wreckage. And what an amazing story. If you grew up with your grandfather and your father being directly involved in one of the most exciting UFO extraterrestrial things in history as well. So I don't know if he wants to talk about it, but perhaps in the future, if this is a successful podcast, he might come back and talk about it again. So we're talking about spacecraft there for a little bit. Did you see what happened in the news, I think last week, in terms of landing things on the moon and conspiracy theories? One of the big conspiracy theories is if we could land the Apollo 11 through to Apollo 17 on the moon in the 1960s and early 70s, why can't we do it now? And this week, not NASA directly, but a NASA-funded project tried to land the Odysseus lander on the moon. What happened to that, Chad?
Well, if you've been following the story, they had some difficulties with their approach towards when they were trying to land this lunar module initially, and they had to change to a backup system or a different system on board, one that NASA had provided, or had some equipment NASA had given them, and that they were trying to adjust their landing accordingly. And unfortunately, it didn't work as they had hoped. It landed, but it, I think, broke two, or they're speculating two of its landing struts were broken, and it ended up tipping over, which impeded its functionality and ability to communicate back to Earth and recharge, because it's using solar panels to power up all that equipment on board. And I guess they are facing the surface, or not getting the full exposure to the sun that they need to stay charged. So there was some difficulties in the landing of this module, which and unfortunately they didn't get to have it upright. And I think they've attributed to maybe a switch that was failed to be flipped before the module was attached to the rocket that brought it up into space.
So the first failure, there was a series of failures and a series of fixes as well, which is what I love about this. Is so the first thing that failed, I think, was the laser guiding system to help to get them a safe landing. That failed.
Due
in
to a
moments-
switch
that was
not
a
being
switch
flipped.
that failed, okay.
That's what I read. Now, obviously, me and you haven't been to the moon to go see for ourselves, but according to what they're reporting, there was a switch that was failed to be flipped before. So I guess the module gets attached, completely powered off, or in a state ready to be turned on once it's detached from the rocket. And then whenever that happened, they realized maybe a switch that should have been turned on before wasn't, and that caused the onboard laser guidance system, which is what they were using to help the module land, wasn't working. And I guess that's a huge part of it, right? Because of the atmosphere on the moon, they need these additional measurements to properly have the craft land. Otherwise, it will crash and not work at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Difference being in Apollo 11, they had pilots that were landing it, manually. Literally manually for Apollo 11. And I think the other thing is, so that laser guidance system failed, but they had an experimental LiDAR system on board, which they deployed. And so they've, bit of redundancy there. They fixed it and they managed to land the spacecraft because, we're talking about partial successes or partial failures. If it had hit the ground at high velocity, as many other Apollo lunar landers have done recently, then it would have been a complete failure. So they managed to do that, toppled over. They were supposed to, during the landing, deploy something called an Eagle Cam. They're supposed to shoot this camera up in the air, which is going to follow it down and take selfies basically of the landing ship as well. That didn't deploy during the landing process, but they did shoot it out afterwards. And it traveled about, I think, 11 foot or something. And they've got some photos. And so in terms of data, I think they've managed to fix that and they've got some good data back from that as well. So that's kind of another example of something which could have been a complete failure turning into success or partial success because of some clever engineering stuff as well. So I've also posted a link into the chat for my Apollo 13 blog, which is the most successful thing that I've ever written, which says basically that Apollo 13 was the first digital twin. Apollo 13, which you've probably seen the film and heard about, was the moon Apollo project that didn't land on the moon because they had an explosion on board and they managed to get the guys so successfully home. So if you've got a second, have a chance to read that. And I'm mentioning both of those things because one of the next guests we've got coming up on the podcast is this week or next week. I'm interviewing NASA as well about their use of simulation and how they use simulation to avoid collisions in space. So that should be really exciting. What other episodes do we have coming up on the podcast, Chad?
Yeah, we have a couple of interesting episodes coming up. I just want to, before we jump to that, read one quote that I heard about this whole situation. I think it sums it up really nicely. You don't mind? It's from Jonathan McDowell, from the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. Jeez, that's mouthful. He said, "This is what he said." Unfortunately, I'm not used to doing this live. We're used to doing this recorded as a podcast, right? So this whole live thing is throwing me. So anyhow, he summed up the situation from the past week like this. We feel like it's a solved problem, mainly because, we did this 52 years ago, but it's still cutting edge to land on the moon. And like you said, several other attempts have been made recently, not that long ago, that they had to abort completely and it came back to Earth. So it's a very difficult thing, even though we did it in the past. And it's maybe generally we underestimate just how complex it is. So, it is a success that they were able to get something up there that was functional, even if it wasn't exactly how they intended it to be initially.
And in the next few years, they're going to be trying to land the people on the moon again, aren't they? As well.
That's all. This is all towards that Artemis project, which is to get a moon base. Actually, not just a moon base. The word that's being flung around now is lunar economy. Right. About this whole thing, right? Like we're talking about the lunar economy because this was a completely commercial endeavor, right? I mean, NASA helped fund it and they put some of their projects on board, Odysseus, but this was a commercial enterprise. It was a private entity that did this, and this is leading to what they're calling the lunar economy. So hopefully we can fix the economy here on Earth first before we start talking about lunar economy. I wonder what the inflation rate is on the moon right now. But putting all that aside,
there's no atmosphere, so there's no air pressure, so it's probably quite low
now by now. Another thing that before we get into other episodes, another thing, I don't know if you read all the things that they were trying to do on this. Like there was some of the it was Intuitive Machines that were behind this module, the Odysseus, but other companies and NASA were kind of using that as a way to do their experiment, or we're kind of tagging along. They put their equipment, or you can read in the news all the different companies that got involved. But one of the things I read was that apparently they were putting backup data on the module to test if that would work. So basically, how we back up things to the cloud, they're actually trying to see if we can back up things to the moon for security purposes. So I don't know if the cloud is enough anymore. You have to go to the moon to keep your data safe.
Maybe that's where we should host the podcast going forward.
Maybe that's where we're going to end up hosting the podcast if things continue the way they are. But apparently we have to back it up to the cloud. But I guess we're going on too many tangents here. But I just thought it was interesting that we've reached a point where we have to put data on the moon to make sure it's safe.
True. So talking about the podcast, which is kind of the point of this,
point of it.
Right? So I've got NASA. I'm recording NASA. That episode, if we do a good job of it, won't be available until May, probably, because we've got a backlog of excellent episodes. Who's coming up next on the podcast?
So the next episode, which I think is coming out next week, is with a company called Energica. I interviewed them about their work, and it's again an electric motor, which is an oddity for us because it's not a topic we talk about very often on the podcast, but we have these two back to back, and they're bringing it back to earth. They worked on a sports performance electric motorbike. They didn't just work on it. They actually have several sports performance electric motorbikes that they manufacture and sell. And we talk about their journey, how they came to do this and what they've done over the last 15 so years to bring this to market. And it's a fascinating story because they had to be innovators in a lot of ways. They weren't able to partner with companies, and we explored all the challenges that come with that when you don't have a partner out there. I mean, we take for granted, that sometimes that these products that come to market, they get branded with a name on it, but there's so many people behind, or so many different entities behind anything on the market that they have to partner with to get the components or the technology available, and they didn't have that luxury. So we explore what challenges that brought, and just the general engineering challenges of trying to make an electric motorbike a sporty electric motorbike.
And then I've got a few AI episodes coming up. First one is Gabriele Pozzetti, who is a former CFD engineer who quit numerical simulation to take over the AI strategy for a materials company. And he tells us about kind of the skill set that you can take from being a simulation engineer and take it into the new world of being an AI kind of data scientist as well, which was a great episode, I think. Also interviewed a lady called Joanna Bickley Pena, who is one of the people behind Amazon Alexa, who also talks. She has a senior role in industry talking about AI and ML and design, which is amazing as well. That's coming soon as well. And I also finished editing this week, PhysicsX, which is a company using AI and ML to massively accelerate the speed of engineering simulation, and at the moment, particularly CFD as well. And that should be coming out too. These are guys who left Formula One to kind of took the tools they had in Formula One to basically massively accelerate. Instead of doing, a simulation in hours, they're doing thousands of simulations every hour as well. So that'll be really exciting as well. And after that, sometime the NASA one. So we've got lots of stuff coming up. How do people find the podcast, Chad?
It's on Spotify. It's on Apple. Just search for the Engineer Innovation Podcast. I put links to those platforms in the chat as well. But look for the Engineer Innovation Podcast with Stephen Ferguson and Chad Galamzan on those platforms. And you can listen to the episodes we've already talked about, and follow us to hear the NASA episode and the Energica episode when they come out, because we have a lot of great episodes coming in the pipeline in the next few weeks.
And we've got a year's worth of back catalogue almost as well. Some really excellent guests as well. I think one of the benefits for us is we've spoken to so many engineers and so many thought leaders this year. It's really improved our understanding of the industry, I think, and you can experience that too by listening to some of the podcasts. So the best thing you could do to really help us is go on to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, whatever you listen, and subscribe to the podcast, because if you do that, we'll be able to carry on interviewing some great guests. And I think we're going to try and do some more of these lives on a Friday. We're not going to do one next Friday, are we? It'll probably be the Friday after that.
Yeah, that's it. 2 weeks from now, we'll do this again. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about the Energica episode. We'll talk about what other exciting episodes we have in the pipeline, and we'll find I'm sure we'll find something else interesting to talk about.
other
Maybe,
engineering-
hopefully, neither of our personal information will be hacked on the moon, and we'll be able to log in and do this again in 2 weeks.
Right, cool. So thanks very much for listening. You're probably watching this on one of our social media platforms, so LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. So leave us some comments and we'll try and get back to you. So thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks or anytime you want on the Engineer Innovation Podcast. Bye.
Bye.